He offered her $1 million for a single night. She looked at him with a calm, unreadable expression and said softly, "You can't afford me." It all started in a Manhattan cigar lounge, the kind of place only billionaires frequented, with thick leather chairs, old whiskey, quiet jazz, and louder egos. Elliot Hart leaned back in his seat. Surrounded by three of his fellow tech titans, he had just closed a $200 million acquisition that morning and was in the mood to celebrate. Though Elliot never celebrated with champagne or women, he preferred something more dangerous. "You really haven't been with anyone since the divorce?" his friend Bennett asked, sipping a 100-year-old scotch. Elliot smirked without looking up. "There's no challenge in women who throw themselves at your bank account." That was when the youngest in the group, Dylan, laughed and said, "So find one who won't. Bet you can't." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Bet I can't what?" "Buy her," Dylan replied. "Find a woman who doesn't care who you are, doesn't care about your money, someone untouched by this world." Bennett leaned in, intrigued. "You mean a virgin?" Dylan shrugged. "Someone pure, poor, maybe a small-town girl, the kind that still believes in love. Bet $1 million even you couldn't get her in one night." The room went quiet. Elliot straightened, lit a cigar, then exhaled slowly. "You think everything has a price." Dylan laughed. "Doesn't it?" Elliot didn't answer, but later that evening he found himself walking into a dusty roadside diner outside of the city. His driver had taken a wrong turn, heading back to the estate, and the GPS had led them to a service road with one sign lit. The diner was small, a little run down, faded blue booths, metal napkin holders, no music, but it was clean, and there she was, the girl who didn't belong. She wore a plain black apron over a faded red t-shirt, her hair tied up in a loose bun. Her posture was perfect, her movements efficient, her silence louder than the radio behind the counter. He took a seat. She didn't greet him, just handed him a menu. "No specials?" he asked. She glanced at him. "The chef quit 2 months ago. I'm the cook and the server. You want special, try the city." He smiled. "Maybe I like it here." She didn't answer. "Your name?" "June." "That's a beautiful name." She shrugged. "My mother liked summer. Do you like summer?" She paused. "I like quiet." Elliot studied her. No makeup, no fake lashes, no jewelry except for a simple locket. She didn't look like a girl pretending to be humble. She looked like someone who had lived through too much. When she brought him coffee, he slid a business card across the table. On the back he had written a single line, "One night, 1 million." She read it, set it down, looked him straight in the eyes. "You think you're the first rich man to try to buy me." "No," he admitted, "but I'm probably the first to offer 7 figures. She leaned in slightly, her voice low but steady. "If you had offered 10 million, my answer would be the same." "And what is your answer?" June smiled, not sweetly, not cruelly, just certain. "No." Elliot leaned back, stunned, and that's when it began, because that was the first time in Elliot Hart's life that someone had said no to him, not because they couldn't, but because they meant it. And he wasn't ready for the way that no would haunt him. Not yet, but soon. Elliot Hart was the kind of man who made decisions in seconds and changed lives in minutes. His face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times before the age of 35. He had built one of the most powerful AI corporations in the country. Known for his ruthless focus and unemotional precision, he was brilliant, feared, envied, and completely uninterested in anything he couldn't control, especially people. Since his divorce, he had stopped pretending to care about love, about connection, about the kind of things people wrote songs about. To him, relationships were transactions, predictable, efficient, and easy to exit. Until June. He couldn't stop thinking about her, not because of her looks, though she was beautiful in an effortless way, but because of the way she looked at him, like he was just another customer, not a CEO, not a billionaire, just a man sitting at her table. Her indifference was louder than any rejection he had ever received. and it irritated him in a way he couldn't explain. She worked 6 nights a week at that dusty diner off Route 47, the kind of place where the coffee was always burnt and the jukebox hadn't played in years. She arrived before dawn to mop the floor and stayed after midnight to close up. Never complained, never smiled unless absolutely necessary, and never let anyone too close. Customers who came often said she was polite but distant, efficient but cold, like she was carrying something inside her that refused to melt no matter how warm the kitchen got. Her co-workers barely knew anything about her, not where she lived, not who she texted, not even her last name. And in a world where everyone lived online, June was a ghost. No social media, no digital footprint, no photos, as if she had erased herself on purpose. What Elliot didn't know was that June had once lived in a different world entirely. She had grown up in London, in marble-floored mansions with chandeliers and staff who bowed. Her father was a viscount, the chairman of Billionaire Holdings, a powerful multinational banking dynasty that owned parts of Europe's biggest banks. June had been raised not just with privilege, but with expectations. She spoke 3 languages by the age of 10, played piano by candlelight, attended royal galas, and was once considered one of Britain's most eligible heirs. But behind the crystal glasses and designer gowns, there were locked doors, tight schedules, no freedom, and no choice, especially when her father's empire began to crumble under the weight of scandal. When the financial press started sniffing around insider trades and offshore accounts, Lord Bellerose needed a solution, something to restore investor confidence, so he arranged a marriage, not for love, not even for partnership, but for leverage, a merger through matrimony. June was 20 at the time, terrified and quiet, still believing there might be a way to negotiate, but her opinions didn't matter. She was told she would marry a business magnate nearly twice her age, a man who had promised to invest $500 million into the Bellerose Group in exchange for the family name, and her hand. It would be the perfect deal, and she would be the perfect sacrifice. Instead, she vanished. On the morning of her engagement announcement, she slipped out of the mansion with a single bag, a fake passport, and £22,000 in cash taken from a hidden account her mother once opened for emergencies. She flew to New York under a different name and never looked back. The first few months were chaos. She slept in hostels, worked in kitchens, used fake names, always moved around, always looked over her shoulder, but she never asked for help, never contacted anyone from her old life. She chopped her hair, burned her gowns, threw away the diamond earrings her father gave her for her 18th birthday, and became someone else entirely. Now, 3 years later, June had rebuilt her life from nothing. It was small, and yes, lonely, but it was hers. She cooked eggs and poured coffee for truck drivers, wiped tables with her own hands, rented a room in the back of a gas station, and lived simply, not because she had to anymore, but because she chose to. Freedom, after all, was more valuable than gold. And yet, even with all her strength, something about Elliot Hart's face had lingered in her memory. The way he looked, not like a man who expected yes, but like someone who had never heard no. The arrogance was clear, but beneath it she had seen something else, something brittle and unfinished, something that looked too much like the world she once ran from. What she didn't know yet was that Elliot wasn't just another wealthy client trying to impress her with numbers. He was a man whose empire was starting to crack, whose life was more hollow than it appeared, and who for the first time in years was beginning to question everything he thought he knew, especially about himself. Elliot returned to the diner the next night. He told himself it was because the coffee was surprisingly good and the food didn't make him sick like most overpriced fusion meals in the city, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to see her again. June. She was there, of course, exactly where she had been the night before, moving between tables, refilling ketchup bottles, writing down orders with that same calm detachment that made her impossible to ignore. She didn't look surprised when he sat at the same booth. She just handed him a menu and said, "No specials tonight either. I'm not here for the food," he said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. He kept coming, night after night, always alone, always sitting in the same booth. He tried different approaches, compliments, silence, sarcasm, vulnerability. Nothing moved her, at least not on the surface. One night, after she poured his coffee and turned away, he said, "You don't smile much." "You don't either," she replied. "Maybe I will when you do. Then I guess we'll be waiting a long time." There was something magnetic in her resistance. The more she kept her distance, the closer he wanted to get. He wasn't used to this. He was used to women who leaned in, who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, who pretended to care about his ideas because of his portfolio. June was different. She didn't want anything from him, not his money, not his name, not even his time. He started learning her schedule, when she arrived, when she took breaks, where she walked during her 30-minute lunch window. He never followed too close, just far enough to understand her patterns. She always sat on the same bench, behind the diner, reading from an old paperback copy of Wuthering Heights with folded corners and notes in the margins. She ate the same thing every day, a tuna sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and a cup of tea from a thermos with a cracked lid. One afternoon, as she read and sipped her tea, he approached quietly and said, "You know they end up miserable, right, Heathcliff and Catherine?" She looked up slowly. Maybe they deserved it. Maybe they didn't know what to do with love once they had it. "And you," Elliot asked, "do you know what to do with it if you found it?" She closed the book and stood. "I don't spend my life waiting for things that hurt." Later that week, he left an envelope on the counter while paying for his coffee. She didn't notice until he had walked out. Inside was a handwritten note. "I'll pay for your time, no strings, no demands, just a conversation, 1 hour, your place, your terms. $1 million. She read it, folded it, threw it in the trash, and went back to work without saying a word. That rejection shook him, not because of the money, he could burn $1 million and not feel it, but because she had treated it like it meant nothing, like he meant nothing. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, and maybe a little ashamed. The next evening, he didn't go to the diner. Instead, he sat in his penthouse office looking through the city's skyline, thinking of a girl who scrubbed plates for minimum wage but walked like a queen. The image of her brushing flour off her apron had embedded itself in his mind, more than the faces of boardroom opponents who tried to ruin him. On the 5th day, he returned, without an envelope, without a plan, and just watched her from the booth as she worked. When she finally approached, she didn't say hello, just poured him coffee and said, "You're persistent. I'm curious." He said, "About what?" "About why you're here. About why you said no before, but not like that." It didn't feel like rejection, it felt like conviction. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you always use money to get what you want?" "Not always. Just when it's easier. And was it supposed to be easy with me? No, that's what makes this harder." June looked at him then, really looked, like she was searching, past the suit, past the charm, past the reputation, maybe trying to decide whether he was dangerous or just sad. Finally, she said, "You're not the first man who offered money for something he didn't understand, but you might be the first who didn't expect to feel small after I said no." He didn't reply. He couldn't. She walked away, and for the first time in years, Elliot Hart didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something unfamiliar. Over the next 2 weeks, the conversations shifted, not longer, but deeper. She started asking questions not about his company, but about his mother, his childhood, what made him feel safe. He lied once and she caught it. The next time he told the truth, and it felt terrifying. She never talked about herself, not really. Whenever he asked, she redirected or replied with a question of her own. He assumed she was just private, until one night when he followed her out after closing and saw her standing alone by a bus stop, staring up at the stars like they owed her an explanation. He offered her a ride. She declined. He offered again. She hesitated, then got in. The silence between them was louder than any conversation they had ever had. He drove without asking where. She finally said, "Take me to the bridge." They sat there, parked near the river, the city glowing in the distance, and she whispered, "This place reminds me of what I left behind." He looked at her profile, soft under the moonlight, and said, "What did you leave behind?" She turned to him and said, "Everything I was supposed to become." He didn't ask more, just listened, and when she stepped out of the car an hour later and walked away, he didn't follow. He sat there until sunrise, wondering why a girl with no money, no family, no connections had made him feel more than anyone with a title ever had. She started trusting him, not completely, but enough to let him see glimpses, like the way her hands trembled when she held the locket around her neck, or the way she flinched when she heard classical piano in a movie. One night, he asked, "What's inside the locket?" She answered without looking at him, "A name I don't use anymore." He researched her, not obsessively, just carefully, and what he found made his breath catch. Julianne Bellerose, daughter of Lord Marcus Bellerose, heiress to one of Europe's most powerful banking dynasties, reported missing 3 years ago, last seen at an engagement gala, no trace since, presumed dead or hiding. She wasn't poor, not really, and she definitely wasn't nobody. She had chosen to disappear, chosen to live like this, serve coffee, clean floors, sleep in a rented room behind a gas station. Not because she had no options, but because the ones she had were worse. He didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, he asked her out. Not with money, not with power, just a quiet question under a streetlight. "Would you have dinner with me? Somewhere with no linen napkins?" She agreed. They sat on a bench, ate tacos from a truck, talked about old movies, books they never finished, music that made them feel safe. It was the simplest night Elliot had in years, and the only one he didn't want to end. As they walked back to the car, he said, "I know who you are." She stopped walking, looked at him, not with fear, but with weariness. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wanted you to tell me first, and if I never did, then I would have waited." She nodded slowly, like someone who had just confirmed a fear she didn't want to believe. And then she said, "So what now? Now I decide what matters more, your secret or your freedom." And in that moment, Elliot Hart, the man who thought he could buy anything, realized that what he wanted most could never be purchased. The morning after that conversation, Elliot didn't go to the office. He canceled meetings, ignored calls, turned off every device that constantly reminded him who he was expected to be. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the city through glass windows, thinking about a girl who had walked away from a life most people would kill for. June hadn't denied her past, hadn't tried to justify it or explain it away. She simply carried it, like a silent weight she had long since accepted. He had spent years chasing acquisitions, controlling markets, removing risks, and yet here he was, completely undone by someone who never asked him for anything. He called his private investigator that afternoon and demanded everything, the full file, no redactions, no gaps. Within hours the folder arrived, and when Elliot opened it, he saw what he already suspected. Julianne Bellerose was the youngest child of Lord Marcus Bellerose. Born into a legacy of power, raised in private schools, fluent in French and Latin, awarded scholarships, appearing in society columns from age 10, but what stood out wasn't her accomplishments, it was her sudden disappearance. No formal investigation had been launched, no reward offered, no public plea from the father. It was as if she had been erased by design. The last known sighting was a charity gala, where she was introduced as the fiancée of Edward Langley, CEO of Langley Capital, a man nearly twice her age with a reputation for buying out bankrupt empires and marrying into aristocracy. What followed were quiet whispers, hidden settlements, and a single unverified report that she had fled the country with forged documents. Her name reappeared once, attached to a hospital record in New Jersey, registered under an alias, but no follow-up, no confirmation. Elliot stared at the photo of her in the file, 15 pounds heavier, wearing a white dress with diamond earrings, smiling stiffly next to a man holding her hand too tightly. She didn't look happy. She looked trapped. He thought about the envelope he had once left on the diner counter, the arrogance of that gesture, the assumption that she could be bought, that anything could be, and he hated himself, a little more than usual. That night he went back to the diner, not to watch her work, not to impress her, but to apologize. She met him behind the building during her break, sitting on the same bench she always did, reading the same old book with its dog-eared pages and broken spine. He sat beside her and said nothing for a full minute, then finally spoke. "I know who you are. I know what happened. I saw the file." She closed the book slowly, then looked at him with eyes that no longer held surprise, only resignation. "And what do you want to do with that information? Publish it? Threaten me? Offer a new deal?" "I want to protect it," he said. "I want to protect you." She laughed, short and quiet, like someone too tired to believe in noble intentions. "You think I haven't heard that before?" "I'm not here to save you," Elliot said. "I just want to understand, and maybe stand beside you if you let me." For a long time she didn't speak. Then she told him everything. Not the polished version, not the edited truth, but the real one. Her father had always treated her like a pawn, something to be moved on a board he controlled. Her mother had died young, and June had been groomed to marry into power. Every decision she made was monitored, her friends vetted, her interviews scripted, and when the financial scandals began to threaten the family legacy, she was told, not asked, that she would marry Edward Langley. He was rich, calculating, and cruel in subtle ways. He never hit her, but he controlled every conversation, every outfit, every moment of silence with quiet threats and sharp smiles. The night before the wedding, she found her passport, her documents, and enough cash in an envelope her mother had hidden behind a painting. There was also a note, one line scribbled in French: "Freedom is worth the price." She took it as permission, as forgiveness, and she left. No goodbyes, no explanations. Elliot listened, and with every word his admiration grew, not because of the drama or the danger, but because she had chosen a life of struggle over a life of submission. She had rebuilt herself from nothing, not out of spite, but out of principle, and that kind of courage was rarer than wealth. They started seeing each other outside the diner, cautiously at first, walks in the park, conversations over simple dinners. She refused expensive restaurants, refused gifts, said no every time he tried to pay for her time or her attention, and yet something real began to grow between them, something tender and slow, like a melody returning after years of silence. Then came the night he brought her home, not to seduce her, but to show her where he lived, who he was beyond the boardroom. She stepped into the penthouse with hesitation, walking past glass walls and cold marble, and said, "This place is beautiful, but it feels lonely," he replied. "It was built for status, not comfort." She nodded and walked to the bookshelf, her fingers trailing across first editions and untouched volumes. "Have you read any of these?" "Some," he admitted. "Not enough." She turned and faced him. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always," he said. "If I disappear again, will you come looking for me?" "I will, but only if you ask me to." That answer, simple and clear, became a turning point. She leaned in and kissed him, soft and slow, not out of gratitude, not out of attraction, but out of trust. And it was the first moment either of them realized how deeply this had gone, how far from the lives they once knew. But happiness rarely arrives without consequence, and theirs was no exception, because 2 days later, a black car parked outside the diner, and a man stepped out, wearing a tailored suit and a smirk that screamed entitlement. Edward Langley had found her. He didn't raise his voice, didn't cause a scene. He simply sat at the counter and waited until her shift ended, then followed her outside and said, "You owe me a conversation." She froze, her hands clenched, and Elliot, who had been waiting by the alley, stepped forward and said, "She doesn't owe you anything." Edward turned, looked him up and down, recognized him instantly, and laughed. "Elliot Hart, the man who builds companies out of thin air? I expected better taste." Elliot didn't respond. He didn't need to. June spoke instead. "What do you want, Edward? Your silence, your obedience, your signature on a non-disclosure agreement, your apology for humiliating my family?" She looked at him like he was a stranger. "I gave up everything to escape that world. I'm not going back." Edward leaned closer. "I wonder if your boyfriend knows what happens when Bellero's secrets go public. I wonder if he understands what we're capable of." Elliot stepped forward, his voice calm. "Say one more word like that and I'll bury you in a lawsuit so deep your grandchildren will need lawyers." Edward laughed again, but his eyes flickered. He wasn't used to resistance. He left, but the message was clear. They had been found. The past was no longer sleeping. That night, June told Elliot everything she had never said, about the threats, the bribes, the men who followed her, the fear that never left. And Elliot held her and promised, "Whatever happens next, we face it together, not as Julianne and Elliot, but as us." And for the first time in her life, she believed him. The days that followed felt like walking across a frozen lake. Every step made June feel like something was about to crack beneath her feet. Edward had left the diner that night, but his presence lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. She stopped sleeping deeply. Every sound outside her window made her body stiffen, and every glance from a stranger felt like a message. Elliot tried to maintain some normalcy, but even he couldn't hide the shift in his energy. His schedule changed, his driver rotated, and extra security appeared around his building without explanation. She noticed, of course, but said nothing, knowing he did it for her safety, not for control. What neither of them realized was that Edward wasn't acting alone. Her father had been watching from a distance for months, not because he wanted her back out of love or regret, but because the final deals holding Bellero's holdings above water required a familiar name to sign off. Julianne's name. Elliot's company, Heart & Tech, had been targeted in a quiet but strategic attack, a sudden breach in digital infrastructure, a wave of negative press about his AI ethics board, 3 major partners backing out of an upcoming project with no clear reason, all within 48 hours. When he confronted his legal team, one of them muttered under his breath, "Someone with serious influence wants you out of the way." That same day, a confidential letter arrived at June's doorstep, unsigned, but inside was a single phrase typed in red ink: "You can't run forever." She didn't tell Elliot right away. Instead, she went to the bridge where they first shared truths, sat alone for 2 hours, and stared into the water until the cold wind blurred her vision. She knew what this meant. Her father was forcing her hand without ever appearing, using power the way only old money knew how, silently and completely. That evening, as Elliot poured her tea in the apartment, she said, "I need to disappear again." He froze, the teacup in his hand trembling slightly. "Why?" "Because it's happening again, but this time it's not just me. They're coming for you, too." "Then let them come," he said. "You think I've never fought a war before? Not like this?" June whispered. "This isn't about lawsuits or headlines. This is about bloodlines, legacy, control. This is about a world that doesn't understand no." He sat beside her, took her hand, looked her in the eyes, and said, "If you run, you teach them they can always push you into silence. If we stay and fight, we show them that even daughters of dynasties get to choose their future." She looked away, then back again, and in a moment that was both terrifying and strangely liberating, she nodded. They went public 3 days later, not with a press conference or a headline, but with a single social media post from Elliot's personal account, a photo of them together, her head on his shoulder, no caption, no explanation, just truth. Within hours, it went viral, and the reaction was immediate. Some praised the courage, others speculated on the motives. Tabloids resurrected old Belarostine scandals, financial sites debated the impact on Heart and Tech's valuation. But Elliot didn't flinch. Neither did June, because the war had begun and hiding was no longer an option. The next move came quickly. June was served a formal summons to appear in London for a family arbitration hearing, a private legal maneuver disguised as reconciliation, but really a way to bind her to contracts she had once walked away from. Elliot's lawyers advised against it, said the process was designed to trap her. But she was resolute. "I'll go, but I won't go alone." They flew to London in silence, the kind of silence that comes from shared fear but also shared conviction. At the hearing, her father sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, his expression calm, his eyes cold. Edward sat beside him, smug as ever, and across from them June, with Elliot beside her, his hand resting gently over hers. Lord Bellerose began with pleasantries, spoke of family honor, of damaged reputation, of obligations to the legacy. June listened, silent, until he said the word duty, and then she spoke. "Your legacy nearly broke me. Your duty was never to your children, only your image. I won't be your pawn, not now, not ever." He leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "Then what are you, if not Bellerose? Who are you?" "I am June, and that's all I need to be." Elliot stood, handed a sealed folder to the arbitrators, and said, "Inside are documents outlining financial blackmail, breach of autonomy, and offshore asset threats made against my company by associates tied directly to Bellerose Holdings. If you continue this hearing, we'll escalate to criminal court." There was silence, thick and final. Her father's jaw tightened. Edward looked like he had been slapped, and for the first time in her life, June saw fear in both of their eyes. They left the building without another word, and as they stepped into the cold London air, Elliot said, "You just won," she replied. "No, we did." But victory didn't mean peace. Back in New York, Elliot faced pressure from investors questioning his focus, market analysts speculating on distractions, and board members warning about image risks. One suggested stepping back temporarily just until things settled. He looked across the table at them and said, "If you want a leader who folds under pressure, find someone else." June watched him with quiet pride. He wasn't fighting for a woman, he was fighting for what was right, and that mattered more than love alone. A week later, while walking through the park, Elliot stopped, pulled her into the shade of an old tree, and said, "I need to ask you something." She smiled. "What now? A vacation? A second secret identity?" "No," he said. "I want to build something that isn't based on escape or fear. I want us to create something real, a life together, not one we have to hide from." She stared at him, then slowly reached into her coat and pulled out the old locket, opened it, showed him the small photo inside, a woman with soft eyes and a smile full of sorrow. "My mother," she said. "She always told me, real love feels like coming home. Elliot, you are the only place that's ever felt like that." He took her hand, placed a simple gold ring in her palm, and said, "I know your past was stolen from you. I can't give it back, but I can give you the future, if you'll let me." She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The way she leaned in, the way she closed her eyes, the way she kissed him, told him everything. The next day, they announced their engagement, not in a magazine, not through a publicist, but with another photo, a candid one, no makeup, no suits, just two people sitting on a rooftop, laughing over takeout, and the caption read, "Not everything priceless has a price." The world responded in waves, congratulations from strangers, outrage from elitists, love from those who believed in redemption, and amidst it all, they stood still, hand in hand, no longer hiding, no longer running, because when you face down power with truth, when you stand your ground with love, When you look at the people who tried to control you and say, "I choose myself," that's when you finally become free. They thought the worst was over, but life rarely moves in straight lines, and happiness is not always a guarantee, no matter how hard you fight for it. For a few weeks, things felt calm. The headlines faded, the threats quieted, and the rhythm of normal life began to return. They moved into a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, away from the cameras, away from the boardrooms. Elliot continued to manage Heart and Tech with new resolve but limited visibility, choosing to spend more time investing in social ventures, while June began volunteering at a women's shelter under her chosen name, refusing to return to her old identity, even when invited to reclaim it through a private legal process. Her answer was always the same: "I'm not her anymore." They started building something simple: coffee in the mornings, cooking dinner together in silence, holding hands on walks through the city, never talking about money or legacies or power, just books, movies, favorite childhood memories. They laughed more and slept better. The world around them grew quieter, until one Friday evening a letter arrived without a stamp, without a return address, slipped through the front door in the late afternoon light. It wasn't a threat, not this time. It was a wedding invitation embossed in gold and signed with a name June hadn't heard in years: Amelia Langley, the younger sister of Edward. The event was set for London, scheduled to host political leaders, industry tycoons, and old aristocracy. Guests expected were not just business figures but global influencers, and the note included a handwritten message at the bottom: "Would be lovely to see you again. Perhaps time has softened us all." June held the card between her fingers for a long time, not speaking, not blinking. Elliot read the note over her shoulder and said, "We don't have to go." She nodded but didn't answer that night. She didn't sleep. The memories kept her awake. Images of the life she left: the cage dressed as a castle, the smiles that never reached anyone's eyes, and the voices that demanded obedience masked as loyalty. The next morning she said, "We're going." Elliot looked at her, unsure why, and she said, "Because I want to be seen not as their product, not as their pawn, but as me. We go in together, we leave together, and no matter what they try, I will not vanish again." They arrived in London 2 days before the ceremony. The event was held at a private estate near the countryside, surrounded by manicured gardens and walls too tall to see over. Everything looked the same as it had before, which somehow made it more surreal. The same marble floors, the same portraits of long-dead nobles, the same staff with their heads slightly bowed, as if centuries of hierarchy still lived in the air. At the reception, Elliot stayed close, not protectively but in solidarity. June moved through the crowd with quiet grace, dressed in a navy blue gown, her hair pinned simply. No diamonds, no logos, just presence. Her father was there, of course, standing beside diplomats, laughing with plastic charm. Edward was there too, though this time with a woman on his arm, someone new, someone who looked at June with a mixture of apology and curiosity. Amelia greeted her like an old friend, hugged her too long, and whispered, "I wasn't sure you'd come." June replied softly, "Neither was I." The night unfolded in slow motion, champagne flowing strings, playing polished faces, dancing under chandeliers, and then a voice came from the edge of the crowd, strong, familiar, and meant to be overheard. Lord Bellerose turned to a group and said, "She may be here smiling, but we all know she's just hiding behind a different man now, isn't she?" The words were quiet, but the silence that followed was loud enough to break glass. June turned slowly and looked at him, her face unreadable, and then she walked to the center of the room, took the microphone from the musician, and said softly but clearly, "I was raised to believe silence was strength, that obedience was virtue, that my future belonged to people who never asked what I wanted, but tonight I'm done with silence." She turned to her father. "You once told me that duty meant protecting the family at all costs, but all you ever protected was your reputation. You used me like an asset, and when I refused to be leveraged, you erased me. You told the world I was unstable, impulsive, and grateful, but I was just trying to survive. She turned to the crowd. I left because I couldn't breathe, not in the dresses, not in the dinners, not in the contracts disguised as weddings. And now I am free, not because someone gave me freedom, but because I chose it, and I will never ask for permission again. The room was frozen, eyes wide, some in shock, some in admiration, some in quiet shame. And then Elliot stepped forward, took her hand, and said, and I'm standing beside her because love without choice isn't love, and legacy without humanity is nothing. They walked out together without looking back, leaving behind the clinking glasses and the forced applause that followed. The next morning, headlines flooded the internet. Heiress crashes aristocratic wedding. Billionaire defends runaway bride. Emotional speech goes viral within 24 hours. June's name was trending not as Julianne Bellerose, not as someone's daughter or fiancée, but as her own person, an advocate, a survivor, a voice. What neither of them expected, though, was the call that came 3 days later from a London law firm representing her late mother's private estate. An executor had been waiting to deliver a sealed letter, a personal trust established under June's birth name, one that had never been disclosed before. Inside was a letter, handwritten in delicate French. My dearest June, if you are reading this, it means you chose your own path. I cannot tell you how proud that makes me. You were never meant to belong to anyone. You are my daughter, not because of your name, but because of your spirit. I hope this gift brings you peace. Attached was a list of assets, land, properties, accounts, all left outside the Bellerose name, untouched and unclaimed until now. June stared at the letter for a long time, then said to Elliot, "She wanted me to be ready for a future on my terms." He asked, "What will you do with it?" And she said, "I'll build something for people who were told their freedom was impossible." Months later, the Parker Hart Foundation was born. Named in part for her mother's maiden name and Elliot's grandmother, it focused on women's education, survivors of financial abuse, and the power of identity reclamation. They kept their lives quiet, their wedding small, no press, no spectacle, just close friends and a ceremony in the garden of the Brooklyn brownstone where they first planted roots. Elliot wore a gray suit, June wore a dress with pockets and carried nothing but a single photo of her mother and a folded copy of her speech from that night in London. They exchanged vows under soft lights with the kind of calm joy that doesn't need to be loud to be real. And when asked what they promised each other, June said, "I promise to never disappear without telling you where I'm going." And Elliot said, "I promise to never try to save you when all you need is someone to stand beside." They kissed as the sun set behind the city skyline, and in that moment, there were no titles, no threats, no past, only two people who had found each other not through perfection, but through honesty, through resistance, and through the choice to love, even when it was hard. Because in the end, love is not about who you were, it's about who you choose to become together. And they chose each other every day without price, without fear, without shame. 1 year later, everything had changed, and yet the most important things had stayed the same. The world still spun, headlines still came and went, fortunes still rose and fell, but in the quiet corners of a modest Brooklyn home, two people woke up each morning. Not as symbols or survivors or names printed on magazine covers, but simply as Elliot and June, two people who had chosen each other in the middle of the storm, and kept choosing long after the storm had passed. The Parker Hart Foundation had grown steadily, attracting quiet but powerful support from those who had seen too much of the world to believe in fairy tales, but still wanted to build something better. June worked directly with women every week, guiding them through legal paperwork, helping them find shelter, teaching them how to start over, not as victims, but as decision-makers. She never used her old name, never introduced herself with a title. She only said, "I'm June." And somehow that was enough. Elliot spent his time balancing business with purpose, stepping back from the empire he once obsessed over to invest in people who reminded him of who he had once been: hungry, uncertain, but full of potential. He hired engineers from overlooked communities, started scholarship programs for young minds in underfunded schools, and built a lab for ethical AI that refused to trade humanity for efficiency. People noticed, of course, but not in the way they used to. This time there were no headlines about net worth or power moves, only quiet praise for a man who had learned how to listen. They didn't live in isolation. They had friends who knew their truth, neighbors who brought food on holidays, a dog who refused to obey any command, and every Sunday morning they sat by the window, drinking tea, reading different books in the same silence, the kind of silence that comes when two hearts beat in sync. One afternoon, June received a letter from an old family friend, one who had remained silent during her disappearance. The letter said simply, "I was afraid back then, but I am not anymore. Thank you for reminding me that bravery has many forms." It made her cry, not because of what it said, but because of how long it had taken to hear it. Elliot held her while she cried, not asking why, not offering solutions, just being there, and that was enough. People often asked them how they had made it through so much, how they had endured the pressure, the loss, the scrutiny, and the answer was never easy but always honest. They didn't survive because they were stronger or smarter or braver than others. They survived because they stopped hiding, because they told the truth even when it hurt, because they looked at each other not as saviors but as equals. They had chosen a life of open doors instead of walls, and it had made all the difference. On their second anniversary, June gave Elliot a new locket. Inside was a photo of the two of them laughing with flour on their faces in the kitchen, and a small note that read, "Love doesn't rescue, it reminds you who you were before the world told you to be someone else." He didn't need to say anything when he opened it. He just kissed her forehead and whispered, "Thank you for coming back." And so their story wasn't one of fairy tales or perfect endings. It was a story of reclamation, of courage, of two people who had every reason to give up, but chose to stay not because it was easy, but because it was real. And in a world where so much is bought, traded, or stolen, that choice meant everything. Because in the end, some people spend their lives chasing power, others spend it running from pain. But the rarest kind choose love, not as escape, but as a foundation. And when they do, the life they build becomes the story worth telling forever.